What's going on, guys? I'm Abby Martin. Welcome to Breaking the Set. So if you haven't heard, ex-General David Petraeus has a new gig as a professor. He's teaching public policy at the City University of New York. And to put it lightly, students aren't exactly happy that a war criminal is now lecturing them on conflict resolution. In fact, over the past few weeks, dozens of students have protested his crossover in academia.
Petraeus out of duty! Petraeus out of duty! Petraeus out of duty! Petraeus out of...
What a warm, well-deserved welcome from Mr. Petraeus. And just last night, students held another demonstration against the retired general, calling his arrival at CUNY a move to militarize the university. Despite the fact that this was a peaceful protest, when the NYPD is involved, things tend to get a little out of hand. That's right, brutally accosting protesters before hauling at least 6 of them off to jail. Can't say I'm too surprised, since the NYPD seems to have a violent response reserved for activists these days. But I hope these students aren't too discouraged, because they're right. Why would a former general who oversaw the use of white phosphorus in Iraq, drone strikes on civilians, and hired thugs to torture insurgents be a suitable professor of public policy? You know, it's a sign of the times when students are more concerned with the professor's criminal history than the academic institution that hired him. So, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is in D.C. this week. And no, not to meet with the CIA's top brass to talk about how to make Facebook more efficient for data mining, but surprisingly to lobby for immigration reform. Now, during one media appearance, the talk ultimately turned to NSA surveillance and Facebook's role in providing user information to the government. Zuckerberg lamented the fact that Snowden's revelations made Facebookers trust the company less, but defended the social networking sharing policy, saying, quote, "We look at every request individually, and we push back on ones that we think are overly broad or aren't legal." Now, of course, Facebook wants to maintain the illusion of transparency. Hell, it's even gone as far as suing the FISA court to lift the gag order that prevents Facebook from disclosing how it deals with government data requests. But even though Facebook would like us to think that it's on the right side of the privacy debate, its entire operation is a wet dream for the surveillance state. Aside from users voluntarily sharing with the world every private detail of their lives, like where they are at every single moment, what they eat for breakfast, and how their baby's grown a new tooth, there are other data mining tools Facebook uses that are less apparent, but equally concerning. Let's go back to 2011, when an Australian tech writer discovered that Facebook tracks your web behavior even when you're logged out. How is this possible? Well, the site uses tracking cookies that send information to Facebook every time a user visits a page installed with some kind of Facebook plugin, which is estimated to be almost 50% of the top 10,000 websites in the world. Now, after these allegations, Facebook changed some aspects of the practice, but maintained that they have to continue tracking users after logging out for safety and spam purposes. Safety and spam purposes, huh? That doesn't sound vague at all. Let's jump forward to this year, when after being pressured from several prominent technophiles, Facebook announced it has finally fixed the bug that exposed the private information of 6 million users over the course of a year. This revelation alone was bad enough. But while confessing to this data leak, Facebook affirmed something even more disturbing. The site secretly collects information on its users that they haven't even shared with the network. Now, let me explain. After denying it for years, the social media giant admitted to creating shadow profiles of its members. Now, these profiles are essentially made up of emails, phone numbers, and contact connections that Facebook collects through your friends, friends of friends, and friends of friends of friends. It's information that's being gathered behind closed doors and without user consent. But not only does the social media behemoth collect this info on its own users, it goes after non-Facebook users as well. That's right. Even if you're not on Facebook, there's a shadow profile waiting for you. You see, the corporation rolled out a mobile download your information tool in 2010 to get users to integrate their address books with their accounts. Shockingly, this move allowed the site to compile shadow profiles on everyone possible, including those without accounts. So the network's basic policy on this matter is that your personal data isn't really yours. It belongs to your friends, and if your friend shares that information with the site, tough luck. It can do whatever the hell it wants with it. Which brings us full circle to Zuckerberg's claim that Facebook pushes back on many of the government's data requests. In just the first half of 2013, 74 different countries have sought data on 38,000 Facebook users. And guess which country is responsible for almost a third of those requests? You guessed it, the good old US of A. And how often did Facebook comply with those requests according to its own reports? Nearly 80% of the time. So, knowing that the network is essentially the data mining arm of the NSA, is it any wonder that 11 million people have dropped their accounts over privacy concerns? But if you, like me, rely on the site to promote your business or spread information, here are some measures you can take to make it more difficult for the site to track you. First, scrub your system clean of all Facebook cookies after you log out, or install a browser extension to block Facebook services on third-party sites like AdBlock Plus, and Facebook Disconnect. Look, in the world of social networking, it's almost impossible to hide. You can at least take some steps to become more invisible from Big Brother's roving eye. Just ahead of a White House visit by Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, it looks like Obama will be meeting with Iran's recently elected president, Hassan Rouhani, at the UN General Assembly. And amidst the international debate over the Syria crisis and the instability that continues to grip the region, news of Obama's meeting with Iran's leadership is sending a breath of optimism. However, in Iran, the economy continues a steady decline. It's partly the result of crippling sanctions that experts say are having an opposite effect than what U.S. leaders allege, hurting the people of Iran more than its regime. So what does this renewed dialogue signify? And what could be done to reverse the disastrous effects sanctions have had so far on the country? To discuss this, I'm joined by Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the Iranian American Council. Thanks so much for coming on, Jamal. It's always a pleasure. So there hasn't been functional diplomatic ties with Iran and the U.S. for about 30 years. How realistic is it to think that now might be the time?
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot to overcome here. 30 years, as you said, 30 years of institutionalized enmity, 30 years of sanctions legislation that is now taking an extreme toll, a lot of tripwires in place to prevent this from happening. That being said, there are so many positive signs we're seeing now. Iran's new president, Rouhani, has gone on a sort of personality offensive to try to basically deliver the message that, look, Iran is ready for compromise, and Iran is ready to sit at the table and have a real negotiated process to resolve the nuclear issue, to resolve the sanctions issue, and potentially to resolve a lot of the other issues that are bubbling up between the two countries.
I want to talk to you about something that you mentioned and what I was saying before about the sanctions. You said that it's kind of taken a devastating toll on the country. It's become such a media buzzword. I feel like a lot of people don't really understand what they do, what's happening to the country as a result of them. When did they start, and really what have they done?
Well, the sanctions have been in place, you know, since 1979, but they've really been ratcheted up over the last 5 years. President Obama actually managed to usher in sort of unprecedented sanctions on Iran, and he's had Congress's help in doing that. And the effect that they've had, I mean, one of the big effects that we've seen is that Iran can't get patented life-saving medicine. So all the medicine that is, processed in Western countries, it's patented. You can't get it anywhere else. Iran can't find ways to actually import that medicine. And so, everything from, serious diseases, cancer and hemophilia, to even just everyday ailments, it's very difficult to actually find the medicine to treat those. And this is hitting ordinary people. This is hitting, people who have nothing to do, obviously, with the nuclear program, but also Iranians who, are not necessarily in favor of some of the policies of their own government, but don't have time to participate in civil society or to, stand up for human rights or civil society, but who are more concerned with putting food on the table that's harder and harder to get and finding ways to treat their kids when they get sick.
Would you say that the sanctions have hurt the average Iranian more than the regime?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the regime is doing fine. The regime is not in a particularly bad place. I mean, they have definitely lost a lot of money, but government officials are still getting paid. This is trickle-up sanctions. That's how sanctions work. These are not targeted at one or two people or even sectors, but this is broad sanctions designed to cripple the entire Iranian economy. And everybody operating in that economy, ordinary people, people just trying to do their jobs, they're the ones who are the targets of these sanctions.
Knowing this, I can't help but ask, why do you think Congress is pushing for even more rounds of sanctions, and what would those entail?
Well, look, there's a disagreement, I think. It's not necessarily a public disagreement, but it's one that is definitely sort of undermining this process, in which you have some who say, well, look, sanctions are a tool to be used in diplomacy. We're going to go into negotiations with Iran, and we're going to say we can lift the sanctions if they do, take some steps on the nuclear program. But there are others who are really driving the sanctions debate who view this much differently. They view sanctions as a way to put pressure on Iran in such a manner that to basically prevent diplomacy from going forward. They want to make the sanctions unliftable. There's a bill that Mark Kirk, a senator from Illinois, is talking about introducing that would say that sanctions can't be lifted unless there's regime change. Now, this sounds familiar. This is what we did with Saddam. With Saddam, we said, we're going to sanction you unless you give up, unless you allow inspections and this or that. And if you do allow those things, we're still not going to lift the sanctions because we only will allow for regime change to invite sanctions relief.
It just sounds like such an insanely cruel punishment for the people who have nothing to do with this policy.
Well, Mark Kirk and others would say, look, this is a regime that punishes its people, and so these are all legitimate ways to put pressure on that regime. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, this whole thing. But they take out any agency for ordinary people inside of Iran, and Iran does have a vibrant, civil society, a vibrant pro-democracy movement, and some of these leaders in Washington think that they know better than the people of Iran as far as what Iran's future should look like.
And what about the Iranian nuclear officials kind of hinting at the fact that they would forego uranium enrichment if the sanctions were lifted? Do you think that the U.S. would bend at all that way?
Well, I don't think that foregoing uranium enrichment is ever going to be on the table. Iran's going to want a peaceful enrichment program. And with moderates like Rouhani in place, they're saying, look, we're willing to make it absolutely clear, have the transparency, have the inspections so that we can prove that this is a peaceful program. I do think that Obama has been good on this front as of late. He has initiated a series of letter exchanges with Rouhani. There are even rumors that Rouhani and Obama are going to meet at the UN. And so this may be a way to find an off-ramp from a military confrontation.
I wanted to get this last question, and in your opinion, looking at what's happening with Syria, look at what's happened with Iraq, Libya, do you think that sovereign nations should disarm at the request of Western forces?
I think rule of law here is really important. I think that, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is entitled to having a nuclear program, but that right does come with obligations. And all sides of this need to view this as you are entitled to your rights if you live up to your obligations. And right now, it's a matter of getting the sides at the table, figuring out a way to sequence a deal in which those rights and those obligations are all observed. But the lesson from some of these other cases for some folks in Iran is going to be, if you comply, you're going to get burned. And we need to, in the U.S., Washington needs to make sure that that's not the message that's being conveyed.
Well, hopefully this is a really great avenue for peaceful resolution here. Thank you so much, Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the Iranian American Council. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ever heard of the Council on Foreign Relations? We'll find out how much influence this think tank really has over Washington, D.C. Stick around. Foreign policy is supposed to be drafted between the president and Congress. But these days, legislation is outsourced. Now, NGOs and think tanks provide policy prescriptions to elected officials who in turn consult with these groups to make any and all policy decisions. One of the most influential of these groups is called the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR. According to its mission statement, the CFR sponsors independent task forces that produce reports with both findings and policy prescriptions on the most important foreign policy topics. Well, that sounds harmless enough. But what sort of policy prescriptions can we expect from an organization whose board members have included some of the most influential politicians, establishment journalists, and corporate CEOs from almost every industry? And moreover, how much influence does this organization really have on actual policy implementation? Well, just to give you an idea, this is what Hillary Clinton said to the council on her very first visit as Secretary of State.
We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
Wow, what you should be doing, huh? Sounds like the CFR has a lot of pull. Well, earlier I spoke to one of the primary researchers on the group, Lawrence Shoup. His book, Imperial Brain Trust, lays out multiple case studies about the role of the policy group behind the scenes and outlines how the group has shaped some of the most important foreign policy decisions over the last century. I first asked him why the CFR is so different than any other think tank in D.C.
First of all, it's not just a think tank. It's also a membership organization. So it's unique in that sense. So if you look at Brookings or the Heritage Institute or the American Enterprise, the Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute or any number of other think tanks you might mention, they're think tanks. The Council on Foreign Relations is a think tank, which is it's one of the biggest and oldest and most influential, or I should say the most influential, but it's also a membership organization that has almost 5,000 members, and that membership is, you know, the who's who of the power structure. Since 1976, I looked at the top 80 to 100, I think it's 85 or something, policymakers in the United States, President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, and so on. 75% of those were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. 75% of all the top policymakers since 1976 have been members of this one organization. No other, whether it's Brookings Institute or any of the others you might name, have anywhere close to that coverage of top leadership and their members. You could talk about other things. They also have, besides their members, individual members, they also have corporate members. And if you look at the list of their corporate members, you find all the top, you know, multinational, transnational corporations in there. You know, whether it's ExxonMobil, whether it's Chase Manhattan, JP Morgan Chase, whether it's McKinsey, whether it's Shell Oil or Barclays or Deutsche Bank or whatever, they're members of the Council on Foreign Relations corporate membership.
And
So
what are these massive corporations getting out of it if they're actually financially backing the council?
Oh, well, they're getting advice from the council think tank people. They have fellows. They have something like 100 fellows at the council. You know, there's a pretty big endowment, so its yearly budget is somewhere around $60–70 million. So with that, they buy some top talent, you know, thinkers, philosophers, politicians, so on, and those people advise. So if J.P. Morgan Chase wants to know about whether they should get into some country, you know, maybe they're already in, maybe, you know, most countries in the world, but maybe they want to add one, some obscure country they don't do much about, they can go and talk to the council senior fellows that are experts in that particular country and ask whether that looks like a good investment too.
You've also said that at least 14 CIA directors have been among its members. How influential do you think the CIA has been on CFR policy recommendations?
Oh, I think that it's part of an overall picture. You know, the CIA doesn't dominate the council. The council brings together, and the other thing I should mention about the council, it's a capitalist class organization. If you look at the leadership, the board of directors, which is the top, you know, people that make the decisions at the council, a good percentage of them are capitalist class. That is $10 million or more worth of wealth. And if you start naming the names, you see they're even more than most of them are more than 10 million. David Rockefeller was the chairman for many years, of course, a billionaire, one of the wealthiest families in the history of humanity. Then Peter Peterson took over as the chair, and he was Blackstone. He was with Lehman Brothers and did other things. He was Nixon's Secretary of Commerce. And he went into Blackstone and founded it with Steven Schwarzman, and then became a billionaire. Then the current leadership is Robert Rubin and Carla Hills. Rubin, of course, made a lot of money at Goldman Sachs and then went on to Citibank after he was in the Secretary of the Treasury. So that's just the very top leadership. One of the vice chairmen is David Rubenstein, another billionaire with Carlyle, a private equity firm. So we're talking the highest wealth levels in the world here in this organization. So they have a lot of power just in the private market.
But still, for people who are looking at the organization and saying that there's no direct evidence that, you know, they actually prescribe policy recommendations that are actually put into effect, can you outline the evidence that you present to back up the theory that the CFR was largely responsible for laying out post-World War II plans for international order? And also today, in more recent history, what have they done that has been put into effect?
When the World War II broke out in Europe, the United States wasn't going to be involved, of course, for several more years. But in 1939, when the war broke out in Europe, 12 days, on September 12th, 1939, 12 days after the war broke out, the Council on Foreign Relations was meeting with a Deputy Secretary of State talking about, well, we need to start working on post-World War II plans. So the war was just started 12 days before, and the Council's talking about making plans for the post-war world, and the United States wasn't going to be involved in this war for several years. So they went to the Rock. The Deputy Secretary of State said, that's fine, why don't you go ahead and do that. Council members, of course, work together, and this guy's a council member. So they went to the Rockefeller Foundation and got $50,000 in 1939. That's quite a bit of money, $50,000, to set up study groups for the post-World War II world order. And they set up 4 study groups. One of them was the economic, another was the political, another was the territorial. And then there was, I think, a war aims was the other one. Anyway, they started doing studies of the world as it existed in that period, 1939, 40, 41. And they determined that if the Axis powers, that is the Germany and Japan, would conquer a certain part of the world, that would be very dangerous to the United States. That's what they wanted to find out, where they needed to draw the line on expansion. Now, Germany already was controlling lots of Europe, especially after it conquered France in June of 1940. But Japan was particularly dangerous because it was expanding into areas that the Council and the U.S. capitalist class, the U.S. ruling, what I call the U.S. ruling class, was looking at as important sources of raw materials and markets, that is Southeast Asia. So they outlined what they called the Grand Area. That is, the Grand Area was the British Empire plus Southeast Asia, plus really the rest of the world except for continental Europe. That was the Grand Area. They outlined this, and we have this in Imperial Brain Trust, the details of this. They outlined a Grand Area, and they said, anytime a country trespasses into the Grand Area, we have to go to war. So Japan, of course, was trespassing into the Grand Area with its push to Southeast Asia. So the United States got into the war. Now, you know, there's much more complexity than what I can give in, you know, a few minutes. But then they outlined what the New World Order should look like. And it should have something like the IMF, it should have something like the World Bank, and it should have something like the United Nations to integrate a new world order that would, the United States would be the dominant power in this new world order.
I have to jump in here really quickly. Okay,
Yeah,
I have to jump in here really quickly because you mentioned the term New World Order, and there is an alternative community of people who suggest that the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and the Council on Foreign Relations are 3 organizations responsible for pretty much shaping all global policy trends. Are these 3 groups really running the show? What's your assessment of that claim?
I think they are, that's right. My chapter 4 of my new book, which I'm going to be calling Wall Street's Think Tank, I think, outlines the Bilderberger, the Trilateral, the Council, the Council's International Advisory Board as these, you know, a transnational capitalist class that does pretty much run things. Now, the Bilderberger and the Trilateral are qualitatively different than the Council because the Bilderberger meets once a year. You know, so obviously they're not planning day-to-day policy. The Trilateral has a yearly conference, and they do other activities in between that time, but they're nothing like the Council. The Council is the root of the Bilderberger.
How dangerous is it to have shadow organizations enacting government policies outside the democratic process? And is there anything that we can do as regular citizens to ensure that these organizations are held accountable and more transparent?
Well, that's an excellent question, and certainly the question is yes, it's very dangerous for democracy, and I think we have a, you know, hollowed out democracy. It's not a real democracy. It's democracy, the plutocracy, and the Council is one aspect. There's a lot of other aspects, the media, the funding of the candidates, etc. So what we can do as individuals is first become aware of this, Secondly, join alternative political parties. The main political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, are under the aegis of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're really, largely controlled. People have to get active. They can't be apathetic. They have to understand these various things and start organizing alternative politics and direct action as well against the powers that be.
That's it for tonight, you guys. Join us again tomorrow to break the set.